how to get this statement that two men met him and then have all these extra explanations about the one main guy who is possessed, not to sound like it's an additional person to the two, not to sound like it's a third person. And the easiest thing, it just came to me, if I get rid of the "and" right before it says "a certain with an unclean spirit," then it should transition into an understanding that two men are meeting him, a certain with an unclean spirit. Had devils a long time. So it should make sense that there's two, and now I'm explaining just one of them. Yeah, so if I just get rid of this "and" here and begin the phrase with "a certain," then it should make sense. A certain with an unclean spirit, which had devils a long time, and wear no clothes, neither abode in any house, but who had his dwelling among the tombs. More and more explanation is going to go after that. Alright, but I thought of something else that might make this a bit easier to read, because if it just begins, a certain with an unclean spirit, which had devils a long time, and wear no clothes, neither abode in any house, but who had his dwelling among the tombs. It's like it's still leading towards the point of the sentence. A certain with an unclean spirit did what? What about him? It's just more and more leading up. So I thought if I could say a certain had an unclean spirit and devils a long time and wore no clothes, neither abode in any house, all the other explanations, that would make this mixing of the verses much more smooth, and it can continue on with these explanations without the anticipation that something should be the object of what came before. A certain with an unclean spirit, what? I can't just have a certain with an unclean spirit. That's not a sentence. But if I could say a certain had an unclean spirit, then it would work. So I was looking at Mark. This sentence makes sense because all it says is, there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit who had his dwelling among the tombs. That makes sense. That could stand on its own, but then it just goes on with more explanation, which is fine. No man could bind him, no, not with chains, because they had often bound him with fetters and chains, and he had been plucked, on and on. So that works fine. Who had his dwelling? That's the point. That's the end result of that sentence. In Luke, it also works out. There met him out of the city a certain man which had devils a long time. So they both say had right at the beginning. However, because I had to use a certain in order to explain that it's not both, it's explaining one, I put that in there, but I couldn't think of where to then put with an unclean spirit. It made more sense to be at the beginning, which it still makes sense to have at the beginning, because if I just move that, I would have to have it read from Luke, a certain which had devils a long time, and wear no clothes, neither abode in any house, but in the tombs, period. That's it. A certain had devils a long time, and wore no clothes. So I could just go into that. A certain had devils a long time. Moving into the other explanation. But where then would I put the explanation from Mark? And it's a problem because after it mentions the man, it goes right into the tombs, but I know I have to say he's in the city. So I already said, there met him. So there met him out of the city, two possessed with devils, exceeding fierce. So now the next sentence I have to use is, with an unclean spirit. Before I go into the rest of the explanation, who had his dwelling among the tombs? No man could bind him, no, not with chains, because on and on. So with an unclean spirit, that has to be put somewhere at the beginning. It doesn't work at the beginning because I have to say had, a certain had something. I have to put the later sentence from Mark, who had his dwelling among the tombs, which is the very next sentence after with an unclean spirit. or the sentence from Luke, which had devils long time. So one of these two sentences, which had devils a long time, or who had his dwelling among the tombs, one of those has to go first. Or there's a third option. I could just take the had, just that one word, and move it earlier. I could say a certain had an unclean spirit instead of with. A certain had an unclean spirit, which or with devils a long time. I could switch the had and with. It's switching from two different books, so it's, would that be out of order? That would sort of be out of order because I'm using with later after the sentence of an unclean spirit. I don't think I can take it out of the sentence who had his dwelling among the tombs, because then I might have to say who dwelled among the tombs, and the word is not that way, it's dwelling. So I can't take had out of that sentence. In Luke, it says neither abode in any house but in the tombs. So I have to leave the had in that sentence, who had his dwelling among the tombs. The only way I can think of this to make it fit grammatically and not have that constant expectation of what about this certain man with all these things, I have to take that had from which had devils and move it up earlier to a certain had an unclean spirit. A certain had an unclean spirit instead of with. Which, I can't just leave that which. If I put with here, with devils a long time, it would leave us with the same problem. A certain had an unclean spirit with devils a long time and wear no clothes. It still leaves an expectation. A certain had an unclean spirit with devils a long time and wear no clothes. There's like no finality. So I thought, since I am not going to use the and at the beginning of this sentence, I can use that and here. A certain had an unclean spirit and devils a long time. And wore no clothes, neither abode in any house, but who had his dwelling among the tombs, and then on and on with the rest of the explanation. So it's just talking about him. There's no expectation of something coming at the end of the sentence because this is all it is. A certain had an unclean spirit, and this, and that, and that. I think it works fine. And I'm not even moving that and out of order, I'm just saving it for now. Because I was going to use it before at the beginning of this sentence. Now I'm just putting the others earlier, before that word. Immediately there met him out of the city two possessed with devils, exceeding fierce, so that no man might pass that way. A certain had an unclean spirit, and devils a long time, and wore no clothes. So it perfectly explains that now I'm speaking about one of the two, and it flows well. A certain had an unclean spirit, and devils a long time, and wore no clothes, neither abode in any house, but who had his dwelling among the tombs. So it works according to Mark and Luke, because now all this explanation is only applying to one, which is all that you can gather from Mark and Luke, because these explanations are not in Matthew when it mentions two. So I don't want to attribute all of these words to both when it's not clear, it's not certain that they are attributed to both. You could say, yes, this man wore no clothes, but where it says that in Luke, it's only talking about one. There's only ever a mention of one of the possessed. So it would be wrong of me to then say that actually applies to both. It's not certain. So now it works fine. All the rest of this explanation is only applied to the one mentioned in Mark and Luke, and yet still, they're both there.